Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me here for this lesson on principles of discipline in the workplace. In this lesson, we're going to talk about Douglas McGregor's hot stove rule of discipline. Now, McGregor is more commonly known for his motivational theories such as Theory X, Theory Y, but his hot stove rule of discipline has gained quite the following within the field of human resource management. We've broken down the hot stove rule of discipline into four different parts that each serve as analogies between a hot stove and best practices for implementing discipline within the workplace. The first part we're going to look at is that the hot stove gives warning. And how the hot stove gives warning is that when a burner is hot, it turns red. So it shows people who are around the stove in the kitchen what burner is going to be dangerous. And the warning serves to say if you touch the red burner or the burner that's giving off heat, you are going to get burned. Now, within our organizations, we can do something similar here by having clear policies and procedures for employees, and those policies and procedures should lay out consequences. Okay, and an example of this might be we have some cases where employers are concerned about how their employees behave on social media. But early on, in the early days of social media, there weren't always rules and regulations as to how we expected our employees to behave, and the consequences weren't clearly spelled out. So employees might do something on social media and be disciplined, but they didn't necessarily know what was coming. Okay, and that created some perceptions of inequity, some perceptions of issues of fairness. So we want to make sure that we have rules, policies, and procedures for our employees so that they understand what it is that's expected of them and what's going to happen if they don't. So in the social media case, companies should have policies that explain exactly how they expect their employees to behave on social media and what the consequences are for violating those policies. All right, part two of the hot stove rule says ignore the warning and you will get burned. Okay, so if you see a red burner on a stove and you touch that burner, you're going to experience a burn. Okay, pretty simple. And within our organizations, we can emulate this by making sure that when employees break rules, there are consequences. Okay, and when we don't do that, what happens is we train our employees that the rules don't actually matter. So for example, one company that I worked in, we had very strict rules, policies, and procedures that were laid out around how we could invoice customers. And the reason for this was that the company wanted to make sure that managers were not manipulating invoicing to increase their bonuses. Unfortunately, though, many managers violated these rules and weren't held accountable. So over time, the culture became one in which managers knew that even though there was a set of rules about invoicing, those rules weren't enforced. So it was almost as if they didn't exist. And I actually had one time where my district manager was directing me to break one of the invoicing rules, and I told him that I couldn't because it was a violation of company policy, and he laughed at me as if the policy didn't even exist. So we have to make sure that when our employees break rules, there are consequences. Part three of the hot stove rule says that the burn is going to be immediate. Okay, so you don't touch the hot stove and a week later develop a burn. You touch the hot stove, you feel the pain, you pull your hand back because you have been burned. Okay, within our organizations, discipline should be timely, and there's a few reasons for this. Most importantly, we want to make sure that our employees draw the connection between their behavior that violated a rule and the discipline that is enacted. Okay. Additionally, we want to make sure we don't create a culture of fear and uncertainty where an employee violates a rule and then wonders every day if there's going to be a consequence. If there is a consequence, the employee should be aware of it. They should be aware of it quickly so that we can move forward in a productive manner. Okay, now part four of the hot stove rule says that everyone gets the same burn and you get burned every time. Okay, so if the stove is hot and different people come into the kitchen and they all touch the stove, they all get the same burn. Okay, now this might seem pretty basic, but all we're saying here is that discipline should be consistent. Okay, and the reason for this is that if discipline is not consistent, then we have problems in terms of what our employees expect. So every time you violate a rule, you should consistently be held accountable for it. And if others violate the rule, they should be held consistently accountable as well. And this can be very, very tough. I worked for one company where our policies and procedures strictly stated that if an employee was caught stealing, they had to be terminated. They had to experience an employment separation. Now, in some cases, this was pretty easy. In cases where people were stealing thousands of dollars, it was very easy to make the decision to end their employment with the company. However, I had many times over the course of my career where employees were stealing less than $100 worth of product that was for sale. And it was rather challenging because at that point in time, less than $100 in product was nothing compared to the thousands that I had seen other people steal. But the rules specifically stated that if you were caught stealing, you had to be terminated. So, in order to be consistent in applying those rules, even somebody who was caught stealing something as little as a $3 bag of peanuts had to be terminated. Okay, now finally, part five builds on part four, and it says that the hot stove doesn't care who it burns. And the idea here is that discipline must be impersonal. Now, this can get really tough when our best employees are violating company policies. And where I've seen this in industry very, very often is when top salespeople come into work late. So we might have, say, a policy that says if you have 3 tardy arrivals within a certain time period, then you go through a discipline process. But what I often saw when I was in industry is that when the person who was late frequently was a top performer, managers tended to turn a blind eye to that. And what that did is that created some perceptions of inequity and issues of fairness within the workplace, and ultimately was damaging to morale. So we need to make sure that it doesn't matter who's violating the policies, who's breaking the rules, that if our employees are breaking the rules, they're all held accountable the same way, and that decision is not dependent upon who is violating the rules. Okay? And with that, that summarizes McGregor's hot stove rule. I hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll talk to you soon.